My name is Juliette Hisney. I'm an attorney and special education advocate licensed in Virginia. And I am here to discuss with you, and actually with my friend Michelle Best here, who's very active in the Cure JM organization, to talk about some of the legal protections that exist for children with disabilities, and also how that connects to the disease that you and your families are managing, and lots of practical advice today. So we're not going to get into a lot of technical stuff with the legal stuff. The slides are very dense. Certainly, if you find yourselves needing to obtain services, I would recommend that you go back to the slides and read those in depth, but I am not going to read aloud from the slides because that's not really an interactive presentation. Plus, it would be dry as dirt. So let's not do that. But I would like to give you a general overview. Now, there are lots of laws in the United States, right, that affect people with disabilities, and these are somewhat focused on school that I'm going to talk about now. Are there people in the room who have adults who are helping adults with the disease? Is this all child-oriented? Okay. I just want to make sure that I understood that, because there are other statutes that can apply to adults with disabilities, such as Social Security disability and Medicaid potentially. So, so let's get down to it. There are three major U.S. laws that afford rights to individuals with disabilities, and they play a major role in how we help people with disabilities engage fully in their lives, in school, and in the community. The first one that is the most specific to school is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That is the law that creates special education services in the schools, and that is a very involved, very complex law, but it is the reason why we have services for children with disabilities in public schools across the country, is because of that law and its precursor law. So that's one. I'm sorry? You've never heard about it, but you've heard of special education. So let me speak very briefly about special education, because I think that's an interesting point that you raised, that you've never heard of it. I think that most people, until they dive into the special education universe, don't know much about it. And they may think, okay, well, that's for kids with severe cognitive disabilities, children who have major physical disabilities. Actually, it's really broad, and it's been broadened over time, both through the courts and through amendments to the statutory authority. And it can cover a wide range of children. So everyone from children with diabetes, children who have attention deficit disorder, children who have severe autism, children with Down syndrome, children with traumatic brain injury. There's a lot of different categories, and some of them are very specifically identified in the federal law and in the implementing regulations, both at the federal level and at the state level. So those laws are extremely broad, and the range of services can be very, very broad. And just because you have a student who's receiving special education services does not mean that that student is in a segregated setting, or that they're receiving services in a self-contained, what they call self-contained special education classroom. So I want to make that clear, because some children will have more than one disability. They may have a physical condition, and they may have other disabilities, which could make it more complex trying to serve their needs. But special education is a lot broader than I think many people realize. So that's the first one. The second one is Section 504, which is probably the one that's going to be most significant for most of you all here today. And that refers to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And that is a law that provides for accommodations. If you don't qualify for special education, you can still get accommodations under Section 504 for publicly funded programs. So that actually can even apply in private programs if they receive any kind of federal funding. And then there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, which you probably have all heard of, which also applies and has similar kinds of protections as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Both the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act are actually discrimination laws. They're not about providing services because of the status of somebody. They're about ensuring equal access. And so what does that mean? Equal access is basically you're allowed to do the same kinds of things that everybody else is allowed to do, okay? So being able to access government services, school events, sports even, potentially, anything you can really think of. You know, this can come up very frequently in the school context for field trips, because if they're school sponsored, then that would apply. And so, you know, there are many, many protections in place under both ADA and Section 504, even if you can't get special education services or that's not appropriate for your child. Now, another two laws that are really important for you to know about are HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and another privacy law called FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. These are aimed at two different things. One is the medical records piece. The other is the educational records. And so under these acts, you have a couple of different kinds of rights. One is access to information, okay, a right to access the information for your loved one if you have, you know, basically parental rights and custodial rights. And the other is for the right to access, whether that's medical or educational records, depending on which law. And then the other is the right to privacy, the right to confidentiality, okay? And so it's kind of two different sets of rights within each one of these statutes that applies. So I raised the difference between HIPAA and FERPA here because it's important to be cognizant and think about the privacy rights of your child. And yet, when you're in the school setting, or really any other setting where you're trying to get them services or accommodations, you need to share information in order to make people aware that your child has a need. So if you're sharing medical information, then it would normally fall under HIPAA, okay? But if you're providing it and you're giving it, putting it into the educational record, it kind of starts to lose that protection, right? It ends up becoming an educational record. That doesn't mean it doesn't have any protection, but it doesn't have the same degree of protection under FERPA as it would have under HIPAA. So I'll give you an example of why that might matter, okay? So it could be that you have someone who has a physical disability because of a disease, and they also have a mental health disorder, okay? And you might not want information about that mental health disorder shared with other people, even if it is something that affects them. You might not want that record to be floating all through the school. So let's suppose it's something like, I'll take the most an example that would be dramatic, okay? So let's suppose it's paranoid schizophrenia, okay? That raises a red flag for a lot of people. People may be discriminated against because they have that diagnosis, you know. So that is something you probably would want to keep pretty close to the belt and be very careful with doctor's letters in terms of how you describe things in order to identify what those needs are for that student. And then at that point, maybe you wouldn't want to give the school the diagnostic records, right? So it's a judgment call always. Yes?
I'm sorry.
Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So I have to repeat the question because we're being recorded. So you're asking if your child has a flare and they're going to be out of school, then what would you do to notify them?
Well, I normally send an email saying she'll be out due to this disease.
Mm-hmm. You normally send an email. We're going to cover this later, actually, but the short answer, you're going to want the protection of a medical doctor's note most of the time. All right, let's move along. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go into every single detail here, but there's a comparison in the slides of um, basic aspects of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and Section 504 on the slide, so you can look at that at your leisure. Um, yes, sure.
So is the left in IEP and the right in the 504? Is that like the major difference?
Correct.
Meaning to understand?
Yes, yes. And then there's a description of what's prohibited under Section 504 in terms of the types of discrimination. Um, there are lots of different aspects to this, but the major point is that no qualified person shall be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or otherwise be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity which receives federal financial assistance. So that's pretty broad. There's a lot of protection that is available as a result of that. And maybe I'll give you an example. I had occasion at one point to speak with a parent who had been told by her school that her child was not going to be able to attend an extremely special event at the Kennedy Center here in Washington, D.C., because her child would require an aide to monitor her behavior if she attended that performance. Now, I had a whole bunch of practical pieces of advice for this parent, and it ended up being that bypassing the school and going directly to the disability office for the Kennedy Center was the fastest resolution to that situation. But in point of fact, that was an extremely discriminatory act on the part of the school district, and that would have been an illegal act under Section 504. So they can't deny the student an ability to go. Now, would the parent have to pay for additional support? That's a separate question around the cost of these things, because the protections under 504 and the funding under 504 are not the same. But certainly is an activity that student required an accommodation, and they weren't willing to provide the mother with an additional ticket in order to monitor the child herself. So it was kind of, in my opinion, a pretty obvious example of discrimination. Yes, that was a local school district that shall remain unnamed. So there's a whole lot of information on the slides about the way handicap is defined under Section 504. Diagnosis is not enough for a 504 plan in the school system. That is a plan that would provide for accommodations for your child, although not necessarily services. So what's an accommodation? One accommodation could be reduced work, okay? So not as much homework for your child, or extended time on tests. There's a whole host of things that could be accommodations, and you'll see some of those as we move along later on during the presentation. But you're going to want to look at, is there a physical or mental impairment? Is it affecting a major life activity? And then, once you get past those two hurdles, then you're looking at the effects in the school system and what kinds of accommodations the student would need. And that would be through a process. You'd have to go through a process in order to obtain that. How many people here have 504s for their children? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, since I know this family, I will say they do, but they do through an IEP. So actually the accommodations, depending on the state you're in, you may have a 504 plan and an IEP for a student, or you may have the accommodations flowing into the IEP. So it depends on which state you're in, how that's handled. Yes.
Question. So my son's school decided to put it all in an IEP.
Mm-hmm.
His doctor said, "Oh no, you do both."
Mm-hmm.
Can it all be under an IEP?
Can the accommodations be included in the IEP? If that is the way that the school district handles it, then the answer is yes.
I was in Massachusetts, they only have one or two. But my daughter had benefit
Okay. Um, so that's specific to a state, but like I said, accommodations will be included in an individualized education plan if there's not a separate 504 plan, assuming the student qualifies.
Yeah, but they don't.
There are lots of frustrations associated with school services. So the question was about private schools and the applicability of the 504 to private schools. Some private schools do have an obligation to provide accommodations, depending on whether or not they receive federal funding or not of any kind. That's going to be very specific to your situation, but the school district may have a duty above and beyond, and some school districts, at least I know, are providing some level of service in the private school setting because they're required to do so under the child find parts of the regulations. So the short answer is it probably do have an obligation of some sort, but there's something called pupil placement, which is a parental decision to place a child privately after they've been offered services. So it can get complicated.
Yeah. I had to take
I think,
private school.
sorry, we're going to have to move on because we can't address every individual situation. We have a lot to cover. Thank you so much for your thoughts. Okay, so one of the most important developments around Section 504 recently has been amendments to it that came in through the amendments to the American with Disabilities Act in 2009. And the reason this matters, particularly for this community, is that they expanded the definitions of impairment pretty significantly. And they indicated that an impairment can be episodic or it can be in remission. And I know that's a word. The remission is a word that is used quite a lot, and there are a number of children who are in remission with JM. And so that is a significant factor to be able to explain to a school district, okay, so this comes and goes, there may be flares, and the child may be in remission, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be covered under Section 504 or have a 504 plan. There are a number of other aspects to these changes that were beneficial, but we're going to move along. Okay, so normally Section 504 means that kids are going to be in a regular classroom, right? Because they do not have special education services. So there would be no option to place them into a special education classroom, meaning with only disabled students. Although Section 504 requires notice, it doesn't specifically require collaboration with or participation of parents, which is not really great for parents. But it's been my experience that schools tend to be fairly open and willing to have meetings with parents, because remember, this is an anti-discrimination statute. So they don't want complaints against them saying that they've discriminated against your child. So a 504 plan can also be developed and implemented without parental consent. It does not require your consent in order to implement that at the school level. And it also does not provide for a whole bunch of protections as to the timing of how things happen. So you may have additional protections under state law or under state regulations that can happen. And in point of fact, here in Virginia, there are some extra protections under the Individuals with Disabilities Act that is normally not in other states, which is a parental consent provision that is pretty pro-parent. So this can vary from place to place. The federal regulations and statute create sort of the baseline of protections, and then states can add additional protections if they want. They can't remove protections that are available at under federal law. And that's that part. And now we're going to transition, and I'm going to welcome Michelle Best up here. And we're going to talk about some of the practical aspects of the advocating process. So I'm going to hand this off to you, and I'm going to pull up your slides.
Hi. So Juliet is the brains of this operation, and I'm going to be the maybe not the brawn, but we're gonna figure out how to actually make this work for you. So we're going to start out talking about a health plan. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with the health plan that you might have with your school. No. 1, 2. Okay. Okay. So basically, a health plan is something that you set up with your school nurse. Based, the purpose of your health plan is to ensure that your child's health is protected. I'm going to move over to the other side so I can see everyone. Is to ensure that your child's health is protected when they are at school. So things that we might want to include in a health plan would be sunscreen, the ability to for our children to be able to go to the clinic when they're tired, just some basics like that. But there are things in addition that you're going to want to consider. So to start out, we're just going to go in order. You're going to request a meeting with your school nurse. You might want to do this in writing. You might want to stop in the clinic. It really depends on the relationship you have with the school in terms of how formal you're going to be. The instructions that I've included in this presentation are all the more formal instructions. So if you already have a relationship with your school nurse, then you might want to go in and just say, hey, can we do this? If you don't, then that's when you would send a formal request via email to make this happen. So before you go in to meet with the school nurse, you're going to want to request a physician letter. And we're going to go through that right after we finish talking about a health plan, what you might want to include in a physician letter. I recommend downloading the What is JM. There is a nice little summary of juvenile myositis on the Cure JM website, and I always recommend that people download that and take that to meetings. So make sure you bring that with you. And then you're going to want to create a list of symptoms which affect your child at school. For example, and I just gave one here, vomiting. Many of our kids are on methotrexate, and methotrexate can often cause vomiting. Well, what is the rule for vomiting in terms of going back to school? It's a 24-hour wait period. So your child has had their methotrexate shot on, let's say, Friday, and on Monday they have vomited, and they are now fine, but they cannot go to school all day long because they have vomited that day, or if they were to do that at school. So one of the things that you want to do is establish with the establish in your health plan and with the school nurse that if my child vomits, it is most likely due to not necessarily an illness, and far more likely because my child is on methotrexate or another medication that he or she is taking. So these are things that you want to consider. Muscle weakness, you may want to consider having some PE adapted. This is before you get into the more formal plans, but one thing you need to know about a health plan, can you switch the slide? Or I need to come over and figure out how to do that. One of the things you need to know is that when you create a health plan, the health plan is provided to everybody at your school. This is not a private document. This is not just held within a close cluster of people. This is provided to every teacher who touches your child. So this will include PE and art and music and your general education teacher. So if you were to include information about PE, then that PE teacher would get that information and know that they need to adapt the curriculum for your child. Let's move on. We're going to talk a little bit about this physician letter. For a physician letter, you're going to go to your doctor. Some physicians want you to prepare everything for them. And so this is an excellent framework of how to do that. My child is 14, or not my child. I'm going to use my son's name. James is 14. He's been under my care since 2012. James has been diagnosed with juvenile myositis since 2007. James is being treated in this way and is seen by me this often. Now, your physician may choose to write this on their own, or they may fill it out, or you may provide that information. Obviously, that paragraph they already have. Next thing, symptoms they have. So you're going to want to run through with your physician and provide them with a list of symptoms. You're going to talk about the symptoms of the condition, and keep in mind you're going to want to include any and all conditions. So if your child has multiple conditions, you may want to consider getting this letter from a pediatrician instead of a rheumatologist. If it's just a rheumatological condition, JM. If it's just JM, then you're good with your rheumatologist. But if your child also has migraines or also has something ADHD or something else that is going on, there is value in having a pediatrician write this letter because they have a broader scope and knowledge of your child than a rheumatologist might. There are different relationships out there, but that's one direction to look. So your child has the following conditions. We're going to include a specific list of the symptoms of those conditions, And then we're going to describe how those symptoms can be disabling. And then specific for us, in addition, due to a risk of a flare or worsening of disease, the student must wear sunscreen. You got to make sure that you include that in this letter. And that's true for all of us, no matter how sensitive your child is or is not. By virtue of having JM, they need to wear sunscreen when they're outdoors. And they cannot be outside more than any certain number of minutes. For some kids, some parents don't let their kids go out for recess. I let my kid go out for recess. It's really, you know your child, your physician knows your child. Those are decisions that are made individually for each child. You're then going to go through and list the medications. The school needs to know what medications your child is on. So you're going to go through that. You're going to discuss the side effects. Another one might be your child may, and I know I'm choosing all the gross things, so we discussed vomiting. Your child may also have constipation. When you treat constipation, one of the things you often end up with is diarrhea. So what gets your kid sent home from school super fast in addition to vomiting? It would be diarrhea. So again, you want to make sure that that's included on their list, because if that were to happen during school, your kid doesn't need to come home. He or she is fine. That's just what happens based on the medications that they're taking. So you want to make sure that you have accounted for those things. So the next piece of it is to discuss, as a result of these symptoms and of the medication side effects, the student will require the following supports, and we're going to go through that in order to be in the general education curriculum. And that goes back to things like sunscreen. Opening bottles can sometimes be hard, especially for our younger children, because their hands get weak. And so you're going to just kind of list a few things, the ability to go to the clinic. I've mentioned some of these. And then there are different, you'll have the physician actually make a list of things that he or she suggests that would be good for your child in order to be able to access school. So these, obviously your physician most likely is going to appreciate from you information that would be included here. So let's move on to the next slide. So the next piece that we're going to talk about is a 504 plan, which Juliet has already discussed. We're going to talk about how to get one. So when it's time to get a 504 plan, you need to sit down and you're going to have to document your child's needs. So number one, in order to get a 504 plan, your child must have a disability. Any idea what disability our kids have? JM, right? All of our kids have JM. That disability does qualify for, as that JM does qualify as having a disability. I just want to state that right there. The next thing you need to do is gather evidence of that disability. Again, we would want to include the physician letter, pull up the what is JM article off the Cure JM website. There's other information on the Cure JM website as well. Again, you want to find out who the school 504 coordinator is, and you can get that information by checking the website, calling the office. Every school must have a coordinator. That person does exist. And if you can't find a name, just call the principal. Excuse me. Again, I've included the formal suggestions for how to do this, but you're going to write a formal request for a 504 plan. If you know people well and you're comfortable just making a phone call, that's fine. But this is where things start to get a little iffy. If you're denied, then you want a written trail. So a written trail can be electronic, emails back and forth. But that's when you want to start creating a paper trail. So you're going to explain to them that you're requesting a 504. Your child has a disability. That disability is impacting your child at school. You need to think through some of the things that are hard in your child's school day. What is hard? Is it walking up all the stairs to my classroom? Is it carrying all of the books? Is it writing and taking notes? Is it the fact that recess is at such a certain time? What is hard? So that's different for everybody, and we'll go through kind of some things that are the same. Excuse me. And then again, bring the physician letter to the meeting. Have that prepared. If you don't hear back, you need to call or email and make sure you get back. You do that. Okay, for the 504 plan process, when you guys meet, the following will be considered. The teacher will give input. There will be an observation done of your child to see how they are functioning in the classroom. You will have the opportunity to provide input. You will include the physician letter, which will have all the things and possibly more than what you included in your health plan letter. And again, please provide the what is JM from the CureJM website. So you will have all, that's all part of the process. You'll meet with the school. Be prepared to advocate. Sometimes they'll say, you know what, we're going to try these things. We don't need a plan. We don't need anything official. We're doing everything that your child needs. And that's fabulous that they are doing that, and you can be grateful for that. And if they're really, really going to push you, you can say, okay, we'll go with that. And then come back 2 months later and say, what you guys have been doing have been great. Let's formalize it. Make sure that you eventually get this formalized. Even if they start to put you off, you will not always have the exact same people in place. And at some point you are likely to find that you want this formalized. You want this to be a legal document. A 504 is a legal document. They are legally required to follow this document. If they're not following this document, that is illegal. And that is why this is a huge protection for your child instead of just having an informal agreement. Okay, so we're going to work on accommodations. And this is where you guys are going to give me feedback. So I want you guys to give me some ideas. Actually, before we go to accommodations, let's start out with, we're going to go through, are you going to?
I was just going to suggest, why don't I take the mic while you write, and then I can repeat the question.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. So what she's going to do, I want to start with the list of JM symptoms, because we're going to start there. We're going to go on to some medication side effects. And then we're going to talk about different accommodations that are going to help our kids based on those things that our kids are experiencing. Does that make sense? Okay.
Okay. So go ahead, raise your hand if you can think of a symptom you want to add to this list. Yes, ma'am. Soreness. What else? Headaches.
Unable to use your arm with the methotrexate injection.
Oh, unable to use the arm where the injection site is for the methotrexate.
It hurts.
I heard fatigue. Yes? Upset stomach. Irritability. Mood swings.
Some of these are side effects. Well, irritability can go either way. Mood swings are usually.
So the mood swings are usually side effects, but although irritability can go both ways.
Absolutely.
I'm repeating everything for the benefit of the recording. Risk of falling.
Well, clumsiness, like we term it as clumsy,
Clumsiness.
but in actuality, side effects.
That's also rashes. What else? Sun sensitivity. How about core strength or core weakness or muscle weakness? Impaired gait, maybe? And mobility. Joint pain. He said laziness. I don't know. Should we put that on the list? I don't think so.
That's bad.
Start writing that one down.
What else?
About
How about more side effects?
calcinosis.
Oh, calcinosis.
Be a big thing.
And drowsiness sometimes.
Drowsiness.
And contractures kind of work with, let's see, drowsiness.
Contractures. Muscle
Let's
contractures.
go into side effects. What all happens with side effects?
Nausea. Vomiting. Didn't hear. Diarrhea. All the fun stuff. Constipation.
No, you're absolutely right. These are things we need to
Swallowing difficulties.
yes, swallowing.
That would be more.
Dysphagia. I'm never going to spell that right.
Dysphagia.
S or G. How about weight gain on their side effects?
Weight gain.
Lethargy.
What was that? Hair growth. Lethargy.
Hair growth, hair loss.
Hair loss.
Hair where you don't want it, not where you do. Well, let's just be honest.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, bone density issues.
Bone density.
The blood.
Bone density loss, right? Blood pressure.
How about brain fog?
Yes.
Anybody else's? That's a big thing.
Brain fog.
I think sometimes, like if you have your IVIG on a Wednesday and you go to school on a Thursday, you have problems focusing.
Focus problems after IVIG.
Well, IVIG gives headaches and nausea, so we didn't write headaches yet, so let's just write that.
So we're adding headaches also.
All right, so let's take this to the next step.
Yeah.
We don't have tape. Unless you want to hold it. You'd be a great Vanna. Sorry.
I never thought I would ever be a great Vanna.
The next thing, let's talk a little bit about how do these things, these symptoms and side effects, how do they affect our kids at school? What do you think? Embarrassment. I still didn't hear you. Focus. Yes. It's hard to focus at school. What else? How else do these things affect you at school? Can't keep up with writing. Exactly.
Sitting for a long period of time.
Yeah.
Just press on the back of it.
Okay. What? Walking. What else? Opening bottles.
Just bottles or containers?
containers. How about,
How about
go ahead. No, please, that's yours.
how about having to eat different things rather than the way your peers are eating?
So for people who are on special diets, that could affect. Special diet can be a challenge sometimes with the lunch too, with having it provided.
Yeah.
Okay.
Slower eaters. Well, I mean, our kids are slower eaters, so a lot of the time.
Don't finish lunch.
No, we've had issues where the teacher's taking them outside. My son didn't have time to go get sunscreen. It was not a
Oh,
thing.
no time to get sunscreen.
Yeah, they missed out on something that maybe they didn't.
Missing out to get sunscreen. Oh, yeah, tape it. Go.
Can we see it if you pull the camera back? Can we see this? Stay over here.
Well, I don't know that they need to see it the whole time. Yeah. Missing out just due to absences, right?
Yes. And not having enough time to finish a quiz.
Takes longer. Work takes longer.
Probably leads to more anxiety.
Anxiety?
Anxiety, I think it's
Absolutely. Anxiety. So other things I was thinking about is sometimes our kids might be fairly mobile, but walking to the bus stop and then standing at the bus stop and waiting for that bus to come. So you might need a special transportation so that you don't have to they don't use their energy for the day standing at a bus stop.
Especially prednisone, one of the side effects is that you get colder in the hands and feet quicker than the normal person. So you can't be standing out there in the winter.
So then you would want to include that. So as I said, you really want to think about your child, the entirety of your child's school day, not just from the moment they walk into the building, but literally from the moment they leave your home. What is hard? And so, when I bring up school bus, I want you to understand that even from the moment they walk out your door and they're standing at that bus stop, that could be hard. It could also be fun. They might have a bunch of friends there. You might choose to have it hard. Sometimes you have to give and take. Sometimes you have to decide that's hard, but we like that. And we're willing to do this and accept this consequence in order to have this greater gain. The big issue with missing school, I found not only academically, but that has a huge social impact as well. Yes.
I just found out that when you get into high school, you get docked and it's on your record much more than when you're in middle school or elementary school. Means something for your graduation. I don't know what it is.
Legally it does not if you have that covered in an IEP or a 504. Yes. No, it's not. It does not. That needs to be, well, you can't, if it's not written into the IEP or 504, then it's not a legal protection, but it needs to be written into either an IEP or a 504. This again goes back to why I said you need to have this IEP or 504 in order to have this legal protection, because there are times when that becomes an issue.
Just real quickly, we are going to touch on school attendance a little bit later, so we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, towards the end.
Okay, so we've gone through this. Do we have more tape? Can you tape this one up? I don't know how to get that off. Actually, before we go on that, we're going to go back to the presentation because I want to talk a little bit about IEPs, and then we're going to go through and discuss accommodations from what we've done. Actually, no, we're not. We're going to talk about accommodations now. I take that back. Okay, so this is a list of accommodations that you guys can't read. I do believe this will eventually be up on the website, but I'm just going to read you this series of accommodations just to give you an idea of some that are available to you. And then you guys are going to give me a chance on some of the things that we have just discussed. in terms of the side effects and things that are hard at school, you guys are going to help me come up with some additional types of accommodations that would be helpful for your kids. Does that make sense? Okay, so what I have down here is breaks during testing, because our kids can't sit too long. Like, anybody else have a kid that can't walk around too long and can't sit too long? So they're like up, down, up, down, up, down? Yeah. Testing in a small group, because when you've got that anxiety going on, actually the testing with breaks is really good for anxiety as well. Presentation, access to a keyboard electronic device. When you've got weak hands, you can't take all those notes. Your hands get tired using that pencil for so long. So you can have access to a keyboard. Even at the younger ages, once you hit high school, I think a lot of the high school now are including laptops in their curriculum. I know my son has one at school. Again, assisting with tasks that require hand strength, for example, opening bottles and paint bottles and things like that. You can tell this was written for a younger child, the paint bottles. Here's another one. If your son has or daughter has like brain fog or something going on, it's often helpful to have you can have modified class. No, I skipped it. Okay, modified classwork without compromising skill development. I had completely blew where I was. Anyway, modified classwork without without comporting skill development, without compromising skill development. Students to be graded upon work completed and handed in during class time. So for those of you whose kids are taking longer to get things done, and then your son or daughter is sent home with that assignment they were supposed to get done at school. So then you get home from school. So you send your kid to school. They've gone to school. They've done what they're supposed to do. They don't get all of their work done. So then that work gets sent home with them, plus whatever homework was sent home with them. And what are you doing as a parent of a JM or after school a lot of the time? We're going to therapy or doctor's offices or someplace else. So now when your kid gets home, they've gone through a whole school day. They've got therapy, they've got homework, and they've got the classwork they didn't get done. This is not a recipe for success. This is where, everything steps in, because it's not possible, because your kid is fatigued, your kid is tired. You only got so many hours in a day when you are fighting JM. Again, opportunities to make up classwork after an absence. The student will be graded only upon the completed assignments and problems. So if your student has done a classwork assignment and the assignment is not complete, but they did 5 of the 10 problems, they're only going to grade 5 of the 10 problems. They're not going to grade 10 problems, and then you get a 50%, assuming you even got 100 on those 5. They're only going to grade the 5 problems. So that's a way to work around this. If your student is getting working at school, what they're doing at school kind of needs to stay at school. Homework obviously would come home if you have, for that. But the classwork needs to be done at school, because your child does not have the bandwidth to do classwork at home as well. Access to a quiet or safe space. If your child gets frustrated, if your child is on prednisone, sometimes they need someplace to go. And it's always helpful to get that set up ahead of time. Again, a flash pass. I don't know if you guys are aware, but they can keep that in the classroom, or your kid can keep it on their person, and they're having a bad moment, I got to go. And if they have a set place that they're supposed to go to, then they can go to a safe place, and they don't get in trouble for having exited the classroom. So that's always a great idea to keep in mind. Verbal visual cues to initiate classwork or to refocus. You're sitting there and you've got your brain fog going on, and wait, I was supposed to do what? You have somebody who comes to you and reminds you, okay, we're doing this, let's get started, keep moving on. Access to teacher notes at the beginning of class. Again, this is a big one for our kids who are with brain fog or have weak hands and can't type really fast. It's really nice if a teacher will give them the notes. Often when teachers are teaching a lecture, they're even like today, notice we have a PowerPoint. An accommodation could be that PowerPoint is provided to you before class. Now, if a teacher does not already have notes to give you, that's another story. But if there are notes in existence, they can provide that to you. Communication between home and school about assignments or tests that are missed. Sometimes your kid has missed all kinds of stuff, and you find out 3 or 4 days before the end of the quarter that all of this stuff has been missed. And guess what? your child is getting a D and your child should be getting a B plus. So now you have to scramble. You've got 3 days to scramble, or you have to take an incomplete, which means you're starting the next quarter behind because you're trying to finish up the previous quarter. What you want to do is you want to have something set up with school so they're letting you know what has been done, what has been completed, what can we not do, but what needs to be done in order to finish off. And you want it done in real time. Like your kid didn't turn in something, I want to know within 3 days that my kid didn't turn it in. I don't want to find out 3 weeks later. That becomes too much. In this case, we have reduction of homework by 60% because, again, when our kids come home from school, we've got a lot going on. There are some people who have gotten no homework. That doesn't really fly in high school because there really is value when you hit high school for a lot of the homework. But if you can reduce how much that you need to do. Allowed to bring a water bottle. Some places don't want you to carry it. You can include that on yours. Modified schedule that includes breaks. So if some of our kids don't want to take breaks, they're not going to go take a break. They're not going to ask for help. They're not going to do that. If you have a set schedule where they are expected to be in this place at this time for this break, then they're required to go there. And when the teacher looks at them and says, "You're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to be there." So sometimes it's helpful to actually put those breaks literally into their schedule at school. Extra time for tests and quizzes. If you're working more slowly, that's an obvious one. Allowed to carry a backpack or bag during the school day. That way you can carry your stuff with you, like if you have a water bottle or something else that you need to have with you. A lot for anxiety. Another big one would be to have a fidget of some sort to help you, and it's also a great hand strengthener. Again, access to movement breaks during testing and during class time. Flexible deadlines for homework and assignments. Just work with your teachers. This is something, but if you put it in here, they have to do it, and then you can work it out with the teacher. But you really want to get as much as you can. You notice that there's been everything has been put into here. I mean, it's all here, and then you work it out later in reality. Modifications to PE curriculum. PE is a whole different ballgame when you hit the later years. And so in high school, at least in Virginia, and I'm assuming in many of our states, 2 years of health and PE are required. And I understand that maybe in some states they can just waive that requirement, but at least in Virginia and probably most of our states, you know, if it is required to get a diploma, then you must in some way, shape, or form complete that PE. Now there are ways to do that. So you just need to be flexible in how you can do it. They can adapt the PE at school. There are many states have online health and PE classes, so that's worth looking into. That's all something that you guys are going to want to figure out when you hit that point. At the younger years, my son personally did not do PE. His very young years, he did PE, and he was not pushed to do anything he couldn't do, but he pushed himself. In later years, my son actually went to school part-time. So because he went to school part-time, PE was one of the classes we skipped. Classroom seating to have extra leg room. Make sure your kids can move, again. Also, classroom seating not next to a window for our JM kids. Access to an elevator key. When your child ends up in a multi-level building, they may need an elevator key in order to get around the building. And finally, when you hit middle and high school and you're changing classes a lot, it may be uncomfortable for your kid, or your kid may need longer to get from class to class. So you can leave class 2 or 3 minutes early and arrive late. Okay, let's talk about an IEP. So the big difference between an IEP and a 504 is that your 504 is a list of accommodations. And we just went through that list of accommodations. Oh, wait, you guys are supposed to give me more accommodations. Before we go there, give me more accommodations that I didn't think of. Yes.
I'm allowed to write for him on homework assignments.
Good. What else? You're allowed to write for him. Yes. Sorry. Go. Top locker, so you don't have to bend down. That's a good one. Next. Anybody else? Yes.
My daughter has a special chair with a high back on it so she can rest her head and her neck muscles.
I like that. A special chair with a high back. That's great.
We could get a special lock for his locker. Stuff and also have to scrappy as we could both ways, but
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Perfect. A special lock for a locker. Go ahead.
In high school, I have a closer parking spot to the school, so I don't have to walk from the back of the parking lot.
So an assigned parking spot for you to go to school. I like that. Yes. I like that. Okay, so a bathroom that would have a special with a toilet that has a special seat that would work for her needs, for special need use.
Girls get more infectious.
And also, it's a big deal, avoiding infections. Yes.
Her hands downstairs
Good.
rather than touching everything on the way down.
I like that. So you're washing your hands right before you eat and not washing your hands and then touching everything and then eating. I like that. It makes all kinds of sense. Yes. Mm-hmm. So the nurses come to the classroom to put on sunscreen?
She would just go in
Oh, she went to the nurse's office to get sunscreen.
and the nurse keeps her sunscreen.
We've actually done it both ways at our house. We've had the nurse come up to the classroom, and we've had my kid go down to the nurse. Virginia just recently changed it. I'm not sure about the rules. The rules are different throughout the country. In Virginia, recently sunscreen was considered a medication. You had to have a whole form for it, and it had to be done in the nurse's office. Now it's no longer considered a medication in Virginia, and you can just carry sunscreen. But that's two examples of the way things can play out. So you need to find out how it works in your state, because you may have to carry that sunscreen, or you may have to leave it in the nurse's office. In Virginia. That just changed in Virginia. Yes, it did. Oh yeah, no, it just changed in Virginia. It's a whole that piece is a whole new world. It's no longer a medication.
We like it better.
Yes, so that's something else to keep in mind. If your child is not going to put their sunscreen on because they're going to be in front of their friends, then make an accommodation that she goes to the clinic, even if it's not necessary to have the sunscreen applied in the clinic. If she's going to actually comply with having the sunscreen on only by going to the clinic, then that needs to be an accommodation. Does that make sense? You're trying to make you're creating an environment where your child can succeed. Yes. Yeah, no, I understand that's a little tough though with the fire drill. One thing I was thinking about though with a fire drill, and maybe you need to work out a plan that somebody would think through. But if you had a fire drill, there should be a designated spot that your student might go that might not be with their class, but that somebody else in that designated spot would be. So if it were sunning outside, you're sending them to a shady spot. And in your situation, I can see where you would have a blanket or something that somebody from the clinic might bring outside with them to provide for your child for fire drills in the winter, because you certainly couldn't necessarily go to the locker and then go out. But if your daughter had a designated spot outside, then she could go there, and that person, then there's a designated adult who's responsible for counting her present there, if that makes sense. Yes. Okay, we need to finish this part.
My son couldn't swallow,
Mhm.
so there was somebody designated to sit with at lunch for choking.
Good. So you had somebody that designated to sit with your son to make sure that choking was not happening, or if it did happen, it was corrected. Good. Okay, we're going to move on because I have taken too long. It's all my fault. Okay, so IEP versus 504. Your 504 is all these accommodations that we talked about. That's what your 504 does. It provides a way for your child to access their education just through doing things a little bit differently. An IEP includes specialized instruction, as in you will have a person helping your child to accomplish many of these things. So let's start out. In order to gain an IEP, you have to document a couple of things. And the first one is, does your child have one or more of the 13 conditions that are covered under IDEA? And the answer is yes. Our children have JM, which qualifies under other health impairment. It's one of the 13 conditions, and it's just referred to as OHI. So the answer here is an automatic yes. You don't have to spend any time here. You might want to just bring a piece of paper somewhere that says that your child has JDM, and that box is checked. You don't need anything fancy for that. You've got that one done. Next, does your child need services and accommodations to succeed at school. That's where it becomes a little bit trickier. So your 504, again, provides accommodations to permit equal access. An IEP provides accommodations and services or specially designed instruction to meet your child's unique needs so they can access the general education curriculum. So to start the process, we're going to start out doing the most formal method possible because that's how I'm going to teach it. You guys will all adapt this to your own situations. So you're going to write a formal letter, or you're going to walk up to the person that you know is responsible for IEPs and say, hey, I want a meeting. But you're going to write a formal letter that's going to request that your child be evaluated. You're going to be specific about why you're requesting this evaluation. My child has JM. These are some of the things that are affecting my child, and I would like to have this evaluation done. You need to find out where to send the request and then follow up and make sure it came through. For your initial meeting, you will meet with a team to decide whether or not they're going to do an evaluation. Just because you ask for an evaluation does not mean that they're going to agree to do that evaluation. You have to show them that your child has the disability and that it impacts their or impedes their ability to access their education. So again, I've said this 100 times and I'll say it, or 4 so far, but I'll get to 100. Print and provide a copy of what is JM for each person that might be attending. There could be as many as 10 people at this meeting, so you want to take a bunch of copies. You also want to take your spouse or your mother or your best friend or somebody like that, because you don't want it to. My husband's in the back laughing because I take him with me to all of the difficult meetings and I tell him not to say a word, but he's my backbone. So if he's in the room, I don't let those other 10 people at the table tell me how it is. I have a backbone when I'm there. So, and he does contribute. That's not fair to say he doesn't say a word. I'm serious when I say if you have somebody that can go with you as a backbone, take them, really. Provide your physician letter or letters. Again, if you have multiple disabilities, if you've got ADHD, she mentioned dyscalculia or dysgraphia. Dyscalculia. Make sure you have letters that document that. Sometimes you're going to be asking the school to find that for you, but if you have that already documented, take it with you. Make a list of your child's symptoms and medications, and then include this how that can make your child's day hard. Again, the magic words when you're doing this: my kid can't access his or her education. The JM is preventing it. My child needs help to access his or her education. And please understand, it's not just about grades. Your child has JM. JM is a life-threatening condition. Your child must have sunscreen. They must have certain things in order to be successful at school. And it does not mean that if your child is getting straight A's, that they don't qualify for an IEP. Okay, you can get straight A's and have an IEP. I happen to know that this is a fact. Okay? So you're talking about accessing education. Accessing education is more than just the academic piece. They are also how many classes are they able to attend, relationship building with their peers. Are they doing classes that they enjoy? Are they able to access the full breadth of their education, or are they just getting math and English and writing? Bring any other documentation you might have, and then you're going to need to consent to testing because they're going to do a pretty thorough evaluation on your kid, and you have to agree to let them do that.
Can I add one little point? So the way that's been presented is that you have the burden of proof to prove that there's a disability. Actually, it's the opposite legally, okay? The child find regulations impose upon school districts the obligation to identify all children who require special education services as a result of their disabilities. However, it helps to be prepared, and in fact, it's crucial to be prepared much of the time because sometimes children have hidden disabilities, right? It's not obvious that they're being impeded from their activities. It's not obvious to school staff always how they're being affected. They may be passing their classes, but they're barely hanging on, and they could be gifted at the same time. That's an issue if that's happening. So I just wanted to make clear, It's the school district that's going to have the duty here. But you definitely need to advocate, because you know what? There are limited resources in school districts, and let's face it, they don't always want to provide services to every single person who asks for them.
Okay, once the evaluation is done, you're going to go into what is called an eligibility meeting. Here, each member of the team will present the results of the testing they did. You'll have a school psychologist, which will go through this testing that they did. You'll have a social worker, and you'll probably have met with many of these people before the meeting. So you should usually have all this information before the meeting. And if you don't have it, please request it before you go in, so you're not kind of shocked by what you're seeing in that moment. And many of the people will meet with you, but you've got all kinds. You've got the school, you've got a general education teacher, you've got a special education teacher, you've got a principal or somebody, assistant principal, somebody along those lines, counselor. You might have a nurse attend. Did I list these? Anyway, so, and then you will also have an opportunity to present anything else that you have to add, because things change. It takes quite a while to get that testing done. I think they have 60 days to get it done. So an IEP process can be very long. So in that time, you may have had other things, other pieces of information to add, or you may have thought of something else that you want to include. So you'll have that opportunity. The team will then discuss and determine if your child qualifies for an IEP. To qualify for the IEP, the following must be true. And this is really important, because this is the burden of proof. And yes, the school district, it's on the school district, but often they try not to have to take on more responsibility. If they can evade the responsibility, they often choose to do that. So she's right, it's absolutely on the school district, but really in reality, it does kind of sometimes often come down to you, unless they're struggling with your child, in which case they're like, oh, let me help you. But otherwise, tends to work the other way around. First, you have to prove that your child has a disability. We were able to check that off really easily. That was really super easy for us. Second, does JM prevent your child from accessing his or her education? Magic words again, access education. Write those down, memorize those words, say them like 40 times when you're meeting with these people. My child cannot access his or her education because this is going on. And we've gone through a whole bunch of different things that make it hard for our children to access their education. And then you're going to talk about the only way your child can access their education is through specially designed instruction. So you may need somebody who is sitting by your child because they've got brain fog going on and they're not paying attention. And you need somebody who's going to do a continual redirect, not just a redirect, by the general education teacher. Hey, Bobby, you need to get started on that work. But somebody who's actually going to sit by your child and help them to focus and pay attention and get the work done. So that's the next burden of proof. Do we need more than what a general education teacher can provide in that classroom in order to access their education? So that if you can prove those three things, there'll be a vote, and you can request reevaluations. There's all kinds of things you can do if that doesn't work out the way you like it. There's additional evaluations you can request. That's a whole different kind of ballgame that we're not going to hit today. You want to move? Are we going to hit it today?
We have about 5 minutes left to finish this piece, but I think this is the last slide.
This is the last slide. If you're at your IEP meeting, you're going to go through the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance statement, the PLAF. The PLAF, or your present levels, is basically, it's a key part of your child's IEP. It's toward the very front of it, and it's going to go through a list of strengths and weaknesses. If a weakness is mentioned, they must also give a strength. Do not let them just say stuff about your kid without also saying good stuff about your kid. Does that make sense? Don't let them do that. Also, if they have a weakness, then they must write a goal for how they intend to overcome at least some part of that weakness. They may not be able to overcome all of it at once, but they must have a goal that will address the weaknesses that are listed. So it is important for you to also look through those PLAFs, or the present levels, and make sure that those are accurate, because you may see a weakness that they missed. So make sure you pay really critical attention to the PLAFs. That is the basis of everything else in your IEP. So your goals are basically, you're going to get, this is where your specially designed instruction comes in, to ensure that your child is able to meet that goal. And the goal is the progress is monitored. You should get quarterly reports on that. And then every year you'll meet to determine where your child is at and if you want to maintain that goal, if you're ready to come up with a new goal. Ideally, each goal is achievable in a school year. In reality, that often doesn't happen, but you need to be able to move toward meeting that goal. And finally, so that's kind of, there's other pieces involved in an IEP, but the three big pieces are these present levels, the goals, and then the listing of accommodations.
We're going to do one last section here that is kind of this happened again, is a miscellaneous section on issues that may come up that are significant and important for you to be aware of. And so I'm just pulling this up, bear with me. And I wanted to cover these because there it is. Because they are so important, actually. And because it's very commonly the case that, as we already discussed and have reviewed, there are a lot of things that your child is having to cope with. I mean, a tremendous number of things. And it's a complex disease. It affects multiple organs. It's hard to understand. Nobody's heard of it. I mean, this is very challenging, and it has a lot of effects. So I wanted to make sure, and we both felt, Michelle and I both felt, that it was very important to talk about mental health today and to make sure that you had an awareness of how important it is to monitor mental health in your children, because we feel that is, in fact, really critical. It doesn't mean that you're going to have a crisis in mental health. It just means that you should be aware that these issues can come up quite frequently because of the amount of challenges that your children are facing. Okay. So I wanted to first throw up there, I don't know how many people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You all familiar with that concept? But so, physiological needs at the very bottom, those are the baseline. And the idea is that until these ones at the very bottom are met, you can't really address the ones as they go up. So in other words, someone who's not having their physiological needs being met is not going to be able to focus on things that are higher order issues. They're going to be kind of stuck down there at that level. And when we think of this in terms of mental health, that's so critical. And I think although we've got lots of great social workers and psychologists in public schools, they don't often think about these things in this way. And so you may find yourself in a situation of having to explain this or at least bringing in the specialists in the school and making sure that those resources are coming to bear in order to help your child. So briefly, with Maslow, the physiological needs are the very baseline. Safety needs, which can include physical needs, right? Physical integrity. Love and belonging. That's, feeling like you're part of a community, having love, having friends, okay? Self-esteem. And then self-actualization, which, of course, is at the top of the pyramid, and that's when, you're able to feel a sense of achievement and to accomplish things, and you're a whole person and all your needs are being met. So why is it that this is such a big factor in JM? It's a big factor because, as we've identified, there are a lot of risk factors here, okay? So I'm going to go over those. The pain, fatigue, hopelessness, that could be an issue if you have a disease that's not responding to treatment. That anyone who's experiencing that could have a sense of hopelessness as a result of that. Isolation and exclusion. If you're physically not able to participate, that's going to happen. It's not necessarily someone's intending to isolate or exclude you, but it's kind of a, just a side effect, a reality of the situation. Embarrassment. Children who are being presented with not being able to participate or not being able to participate at the same level as their peers are likely to experience embarrassment. Dependency. You could have a kid who's very independent in their attitude and the way that they engage with people. You may have an older child who's entering, the tween years or the teen years, and just as they're supposed to be becoming independent, all of a sudden they're requiring a lot of assistance from adults. And so that has an effect. Self-esteem also, why can't I accomplish things, or why am I not accomplishing things, concerns around that. And then there's the medication side effects, which are significant. Dysregulation, emotional distress, mood change, brain fog. These are all things that can have a lot of effects on children. And so just wanted to cover that. You can get, just so you know, there is a category of special education that is called emotional disability in Virginia, and there may be other names for it in other states, but mental health needs can be met through special education. So some children may end up having multiple eligibility categories. So you could have OHI or other health impairment, as it's described in Virginia, for the JM. And then if they have other needs beyond that, they could qualify under a different category, including that one. I said we were going to talk a little bit about attendance. So, not to freak everyone out, but education is compulsory in Virginia and probably in every state. And so you want to avoid something known as truancy referral, and it may be less significant in some, the stakes may be higher in some states than it is in others. In Virginia, the stakes are very high, and actually we're trying to deal with some reform at the General Assembly to get new legislation through that can make this a little bit less terrifying. But in Virginia, you can have a situation where not only does the child end up court involved through a child in need of services petition or some other kind of referral, but the parents can theoretically be charged. So we'd like to roll that back to some degree so that we don't have this stressful situation without having the ability to avoid that. So what can you do if your child is missing significant time at school? Well, first of all, you should know what law applies in your state, and you should know what your local school policy is. There should be a school policy on attendance, okay? You should document the reason for missed school. You should obtain excuse notes from doctors. Now, that could be for regular appointments, by the way. It could be that every single Thursday your child has a particular appointment, they're going to miss X amount of school. Document it. Get those notes from the doctors. And as Michelle mentioned earlier, you may want your pediatrician to be the person who kind of handles all of that, because it may be easier to get into the pediatrician than into the specialist, right? Right. What else can you do? Well, if it's really serious and they're missing a tremendous amount of school, then they may require a partial day. They may require homebound certification that's medically certified by a doctor, so that their services can be provided outside of the school setting. Or they may even require home-based services through an independent education plan. That's not the first go-to, right? We want our children in school with their peers and being able to enjoy their time there and accessing their education in that least restrictive environment. That's a buzzword, by the way, for not segregating your children. And the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires that children be educated in the least restrictive environment. So it's not something I would normally say, oh, make sure you get your homebound or make sure you get your home-based services, but there are times when that is needed. And it should be available in your school district if you have to have it for your child. And then finally, I wanted to talk briefly about the difference between home-based services and medically certified homebound, because they are different. Although they both provide services in an alternate location from school, and it could be partial day, home-based services, or homebound. It could be partial day in school, partial day at home, or in the library, where you have the opportunity to have a higher level of support. So you could end up with, for example, doing specials like music and art at school, but because of the difficulty with writing, for example, you could have writing services delivered, through homebound or through home-based services. This is all theoretical, but in Virginia, at least, I've had success in getting partial day arrangements for children who have physical disabilities, which I would consider JM to be a physical disability. The biggest difference, though, is that one, medical homebound has to be recertified on a regular basis. And in most school districts will not allow that to go on for very long. They will ask a doctor, when is the end time for this? And they have to go through an approval process and a request process, and the school might choose to deny it. Okay. The other is, so by the same token, home-based services are actually a special education placement. And so all of the procedural rights that you have under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act will kick in if you have home-based services. When would that be more appropriate? It would be more appropriate if you have if the disease is presenting in a chronic way, and over a long period of time, probably more than 6 months, you're seeing that your child is not able to access their education. They're too exhausted, too fatigued in order to really access the full school day. Okay, and under that circumstance, I would certainly say probably home-based is the way to go. A school district might be reticent to do that. So if you have to do homebound as a stopgap measure, you might consider that as, the path of least resistance. But just know that that is not going to provide you with the same kind of legal rights. So that is actually the end. Oh, yep.
I made a list of some tips and tricks that I wanted to share with you guys, assuming I can find what I did with them. Okay. First, a lot of our kids, because they're tired or they're hurting, they're in pain, they're frustrated, they don't want to go to school. That happens. One tip or trick that I highly recommend is make sure that there's a favorite class that they get to participate in. For example, my son was going to school partial days for a long time, which made it almost even easier for him to skip if he didn't feel well. We intentionally ensured that he was able to participate in a favorite class. For him, it was chorus. For your child, it might be something else. And we put that toward the end of the day, and that was his carrot. If you go to school and you make it through a school, you get to go to chorus. So that's just a little tip or a trick to make sure to try and have your school put in place for your kid. Other tips and tricks. Send a letter home, especially with your younger kids. Send a letter home to the families in your classroom or in your Sunday school class or in your Girl Scout troop, explaining to the other families that your child is on immunosuppressants. Please ask them to please notify you if their child is sick and they're going to school anyway, because you need to know that so you can make an educated decision about whether or not you're sending your child to school. It would be really nice if they would choose to keep their kid home, but we can't always force that. But we want to make sure that if you find out that 4 kids in the class have the flu, and this is the way you're going to find out. You're going to when my son was in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, those 3 years, we had a classroom email group that went around. And everybody reported whenever somebody was sick. Oh, my kid has strep. Oh, so does mine. So does mine. Oh, my kid's staying home. That was exactly what my reaction was. But it also gave people information. Oh, maybe I need to go get my kid tested. Gave me that kind of information. So it's kind of nice if you want to try and create a group like that so you can have that share and have that kind of information. It's not useful just to you with your immune-compromised child, but it's actually useful to everybody in the group. Prepare letters for teachers, coaches, leaders at the beginning of the school year or the team season or whatever, introducing your kid. Make sure that you include both the awesome, because our kids are awesome, and the hard. And you can decide when you want to do this. Sometimes it's really helpful to provide this at the beginning of the school year so that your teacher kind of knows what's coming. Sometimes you might want to give them a couple of weeks to get a feel for your kid and then provide them with this. That's kind of a personality and how you want to do it, but that's actually something that's really good to often provide. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, and we don't have time today, but another great thing is for you to prepare a presentation, or even better, if your child prepares a presentation about JM and shares it with the class. My son, multiple times over the school years, they have had the opportunity to prepare an all about me presentation. And my son's was often all about me because I have JM and all the things that I have overcome because I have JM. I do this and I do this and I get this infusion and these things happen, but look at me, look at what I can do. And that's a great opportunity for you. Make sure that you put the positive spin on it. You don't want to just go in and say, my kid is sick and you guys have to be nice to my kid. That doesn't often fly really well, especially because our kids aren't just sick in first grade. They're often sick in first grade and in second grade and in third grade. So what we're really trying to do is we're really trying to say, my kid is sick and there are some things we have to do, but my kid is awesome and look how awesome he is, and let's all be awesome kind of together. And this is the way my kid is overcoming what's going on in his life. And that's it for this.